I guess that noise means it's go time.
I think so.
Okay, so it is 7 o'clock, so let's get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for School Options for the Fall 2020, Understanding eSchools and Homeschooling. This is a good topic to discuss in a normal year, but especially a hot topic, obviously, with our current COVID-19 situation going on. Today we have Mark Weicker and Lauren Sabo speaking, attorneys at Albite Weicker LLP. I am Leslie Albite. I will just be here listening and moderating if anybody has questions. Back to Mark and Lauren, they are both education-specific attorneys assisting students and parents from preschool through PhD with a variety of issues. Mark was a former school side attorney representing school boards before we started AW. And Lauren had a career as a special education teacher prior to attending law school. So they both have school side experience as well as student parent experience. A few notes real quick before we get started. We will be taking questions. As I said before, you can feel free to type them at the bottom of your screen. You should see a Q&A box. So just type them as they come up to you, and then I will try to wave at Lauren or Mark if I can interrupt them, or we will save them for the end. We will keep this to 1 hour, but we are recording this and it will be available on our website and our newly created YouTube channel, so you can catch it later if you miss anything. And I have to say, technology is lovely and all of us have kids at home, so bear with us if we have any glitches or screaming toddlers. All right, so let's get started with Mark.
Thanks, Leslie. Yeah, by all means, if people have questions as I'm speaking, Leslie will stop me at certain points and read off the questions, and we'll try to get those answered. And we'll do that as anonymously as we can. And again, like Leslie mentioned, I'm a K-12 education attorney with Albite Weicker. With our presentation tonight, I think we'll start with some of the basics of different types of schools and schooling in Ohio, and then move specifically, this session is on eSchools, which I'll talk a lot about, and homeschooling, which Lauren will talk more about. By the way, those two terms are often confused. Many people misdescribe what they're doing as homeschooling or misdescribe what they're doing as eSchooling. And I'll walk through, of course, the basics of eSchooling, but eSchooling is schools or schooling directed by a charter school, which we'll talk about, or a community school in Ohio, and homeschooling is parent-directed or third-party, non-school directed education, which Lauren will talk about. And it's even more confusing because some of the eSchools that exist in Ohio and nationwide have recognized that people confuse that and sometimes refer to it as homeschooling. So it is a little confusing, but I think we'll clear that up easily tonight. So we'll start with the basics, and I think this helps to build an understanding. So in Ohio, students ages 6 to 18 are required to attend school. And that actually includes students age 5 if they start kindergarten at age 5. So this is known as compulsory school attendance in Ohio. So you're required to go to school. And as you probably know, if a student is habitually absent, that can ultimately lead to juvenile court proceedings or truancy. So yeah, it's a requirement that you attend school. And because of this compulsory attendance requirement in Ohio, public schools are also required to accept students if this student resides in their district. So if you live within a designated school district, then that school has to allow you to attend tuition-free in their district of residence. Now, there are 3 exceptions to that. One of the exceptions that we're going to talk about, of course, is homeschooling and eSchooling. But the first exception is if you're suspended or expelled. Of course, you're not going to school, and you don't get in more trouble for that if they kick you out for a period of time. So that's the first exception to compulsory attendance. The second is, of course, if your student decides to attend another public school, which is not the school district of residence, or a private school that's not the school district of residence. Another public school might be a charter school, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. And the third exception is homeschooling. So if you're approved by your school district of residence or the superintendent there, you may homeschool your child. The most notable difference is e-schooling is attending school someplace else, and again, homeschooling is an exception to the compulsory attendance requirement, where you are not required to attend school on a daily basis, and that education is going to be delivered by your parents or a third party. One thing in terms of timing, I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes, roughly, with some time for questions on e-schooling, and then Lauren will do the same, and that should get us to right about an hour. That'll leave us with about 15 or 20 minutes of questions at the end. So we will have time if you want to save your question to the end too. So as I mentioned, there are school options other than those that we're covering tonight. So we're, again, talking about e-schooling, homeschooling. Of course, private schools is always an option. That usually includes a tuition requirement by the parent, for the parent to pay tuition, but it also includes students attending on state-sponsored scholarships. Some of you may be familiar with the John Peterson Special Needs Scholarship, or the Autism Scholarship, or even the Ed Choice Scholarship. The Ed Choice Scholarship is for students residing in lower performing public schools. The state makes available so many scholarships so that the student can take their funding to a private school and use that to attend a private school. So there are other options than what we're talking about tonight. And that might be another seminar we do soon. But again, specifically e-schools tonight and homeschooling. So more people, of course, are becoming familiar or interested in these options, e-schooling and homeschooling, given the school closures and the move to online education by our school districts. All of us, and probably many of you, have been directing your children and their education and trying to piece together whatever the public school could do in terms of providing some virtual, education. And of course, that was on the fly. They may be good at it, they may not be good at it, but you may have seen that your child does well learning online. You may have seen that they actually advanced a little bit better. You may see that you do a pretty good job of directing the education or supplementing the instruction by the teacher. So you think you might have a talent to be able to homeschool your child. And maybe, because none of us know exactly what our school districts are going to do in the fall. I think most of them are still in the exploratory phase, and they're not sure both what people want and what the state will allow. We don't know. There's no certainty about what's going to happen in public schools. So e-schools might be a little bit more concrete in terms of making the decision now to go with e-schooling, or making the decision now to provide and get accepted and approved for homeschooling. So a few different reasons why people may be interested in either one of those options. So let's back up again a second and talk about the umbrella of public schools in Ohio. This includes, of course, traditional school districts as most of us know them. This is Cleveland Heights, Mason City School District, Columbus City Schools, Bexley City Schools, Toledo City Schools, all of the suburban and rural districts. And that can include city school districts, local school districts, and exempted village school districts. So those are all based on, a plot of land around a city or in a rural area that it's set out so that that student can, if they reside in that district, if they lay their head down in that particular place at night, they can attend in that district. Again, these are public. That means they receive public funds, both state and federal, and they are tuition free. The Department of Education, the State Department of Education, has about 660 public school districts in Ohio that are still active. So there are a lot. Also under this public school umbrella, however, is what's known as charter schools nationwide. They're a little bit different than traditional public schools and they don't have districts. In Ohio, to make it even more confusing, they're known as community schools. And that's because Ohio goes through this chartering process for all schools. So it's confusing if we call it chartered schools. So here in Ohio, community schools are what everybody else in the nation calls charter schools. And these, again, are public, and that's also a misconception for a lot of people. They're public in that they receive state and federal funds, and it's tuition free for the student and the parent. And what happens is the funds, if a student and parent elect for the child to go to a chartered school or a community school, then some funding from the State Department of Education is redirected from your local school district to the community school. So they are paid, the tuition is paid basically by the state funding that the traditional public school would have received. Now the traditional public school doesn't lose the real estate tax revenue that they get from you owning any property in the district, but they do lose this per pupil funding, which is redirected to the community school if you elect to go to a community school. Community schools are a little bit more loose in terms of state regulation. They are still nonprofits, they are still non-religious, but they are independent of traditional public school districts. They have a sponsoring organization that helps them with the quality of the education and compliance. And right now, ODE has 314 different approved community schools in Ohio, and most are located in the urban districts, but not all of them. And you can elect, again, just your local school district, you can elect to send a child to a community school. And a lot of community schools are focused on, let's say, fitness or science, or a variety of different other avenues, arts, for instance, that your child may have an interest in, and you choose to go to that particular school. So still under public schools, and then a type of charter school in Ohio is an e-school. So it fits under that same umbrella in that e-schools are community schools. That means they're public and they're tuition free. And the difference here is that these e-schools, they typically accept students statewide. So if the school exists in Akron, they would accept students, all throughout the state because there is no geographic boundary. They receive state and federal funds, but are independent of school districts. Now, we're really drilling down now when we talk about e-schools because the list at the Department of Education has a total of 14 online schools in Ohio, which we're going to share with you in a second. And but 9 of those are dropout and recovery schools. Those are schools for students at risk of dropping out and who need credit recovery. So we're really only talking about 5, and some of you may be interested in that dropout and recovery school. The list will include those. But if we're talking about schools who accept students statewide and are open for all K-12 students in the state, we're really talking about 5 schools that currently exist. And if you've followed the news over the last 3 or 4 years, you might know that the biggest e-school that existed a couple of years ago, ECOT, has been closed down by the state after a disagreement with the State Department of Education over how they count their students' enrollment, and a change from the Department of Education on how it counts student enrollment. Ultimately, the litigation ended in millions of dollars being paid back, tens of millions of dollars, somewhere in the area of $65 million, being paid back to the state, which caused the closure of ECOT. And ECOT, towards its last years, enrolled about 14,000 students in the state, which was the largest single school in the state. But that's closed, so there's been kind of a influx of those students either into the public school districts where they resided or into other e-schools. And now again, we're only talking about 5 that are approved and up and running in the state. And Leslie, are you able to share that spreadsheet?
Yep, hold on one second. Can you see that?
Yep. Thank you. And we had our interns in the firm go through and call the school. They called all of the schools, but I have bolded on at the top there, the public e-schools. The ones that are bolded and in gray are the schools that exist that are K-12 schools you'll see over on the 5th line, and that are not dropout and recovery. So they're general education. And I'm sorry, I missed one at the very top. It's Alternative Education Academy. I forgot to make in gray, but there are 5 total that exist. This spreadsheet, by the way, is on ODE's website. It's not as pretty as we've made it here, but it does include all of these e-schools. And then we added, there are some private online schools that exist, and most of these are nationwide, but we did add some here at the bottom of schools. Now these usually include some tuition requirement because they're private. But the ones at the top, like I mentioned, are e-schools that exist in the state that are funded by the state and are tuition free for the students. Each of those that are highlighted accepts students K-12, so at all grades. And what we had our interns do was call and see how they were doing on enrollment. We expected that maybe there was an increase in enrollment given the situation. And there was, but as of right now, most of them had no deadline, or the deadline was the first day of school in the fall to apply for enrollment at the e-school. So as of right now, they all seem to open to enrollment. Again, if you just Google Directory of eSchools Ohio or Directory of eSchools Ohio Department of Education, you'll find this spreadsheet available online, which does include the contact information, both email and telephone, for the school. And you could gather information from the school about their deadlines and their, curriculum if you contact the school directly. Okay, Leslie, you can take that down. All right, so if you would enroll in an e-school, most of the schools, all of those 5, I believe, provide the laptop, the books, the materials, and that's all free of charge when you enroll. And that's usually delivered via, FedEx or UPS to the student, directly to the student. And the content is delivered virtually, of course, although I saw that most schools from their websites do have an in-person requirement, or they have workshops, 3 or 4 times throughout the school year. So sometimes it's a mainly online focus with some in-person meetings. And there are some schools that exist to do more of a hybrid where there are a few more in-person meetings or workshops that they have. So again, it might be modified a little bit. And then the schools are accredited by the state. So the schools have to agree, e-schools have to agree to abide by the state operating standards for K-12 education. So there is some, there's just not the wild, wild west in terms of how these schools operate. They are a little less regulated, like I mentioned, than a traditional public school, but they have a sponsor. That sponsor helps with compliance and educational quality. And then they abide by these standards, and they have to maintain accreditation through an independent accreditation agency. So their curriculum standards and how they're delivering content and measuring attendance are all things that are subject to accreditation and losing accreditation. There's, I suppose, a larger debate. Certainly, public schools hate to lose students to any charter school, any community school, or hate to lose students to e-schools because they lose that funding. And I think generally, people who are supportive of public education hate to see students leaving public education. But it is a kind of a difficult comparison, apples to apples, because the student population that the online schools are getting is a little bit different. The way they deliver the curriculum, of course, is different. I think it's important to talk about some of the advantages that eSchools have, and this isn't for all students, of course. I know my daughter, who's a third grader, has to be in class. I mean, we went through this last month or so, and although she does pretty well and she's a self-starter, she just is down in the dumps if she's not seeing people in person. So for me, this might not be a good option, but some of the advantages that eSchools have, they've been developing this and refining curriculum for years, in some cases for 10 plus years. So they've been working on this for that many years, when some of these, most of these public schools have been working on it for about 2 months now. Now I think that will increase with public schools, and there's probably going to be some additional options for virtual classes through public schools. But I'd say they're still a long way behind some of these schools who have been doing this and refining it for years. eSchools in some cases are often, and we help students in these situations, they're good options for students who have certain disabilities. It might be social and emotional disabilities. It could be a situation like anxiety, or a disability that affects the student's attendance. If it's just hard to get to class because of a disability or for other reasons, then sometimes if the student can do well in an online school, an eSchool is a good option. eSchool might be a good option for students who suffer from bullying. That's another situation that we've helped students withdraw from a public school and enroll in an eSchool. And certainly for students who are self-driven and who can advance grade levels, the eSchools make it a little bit easier to promote beyond the typical promotion. So, you would have to really petition the public school to advance your student if you believe they were beyond grade level, which would include some testing. With a virtual school, you work at your own pace. So it's much easier to advance the student along the curriculum because they, can just deliver different content to that student, and the other students aren't affected because you're working in isolation. So a few different advantages that eSchools have that public schools are still, struggling with or working on, or it's just not possible. Another thing that's important is that if a student has a disability, that in Ohio, these community schools, because they're public, are still required to deliver a free and appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. So they have the same requirements that the public school has in terms of implementing an IEP, well, I should say identifying a student with a disability, implementing an individualized education program, or a 504 plan for that matter. So the requirements are the same, and the procedural safeguards in terms of being a part of the IEP team as a parent, receiving prior written notices, and the right to file complaint if the services are inadequate or not being provided. Those things still exist because it's still a public school in an eSchool. Now the services might be delivered in a somewhat different way, and if you have a student with a disability, you may have experienced that difference just in this school shutdown. But it's important to ask those types of questions and be upfront with the school about an IEP and what services would need to be provided and how they might service those, how they might service that IEP before you enroll in the school. And then I know I'm up beyond my 20 minutes, so one last thing I think is important to share is that state law in Ohio allows students who attend eSchools, or all community schools, whether they're in person or eSchools, the ability to participate in extracurricular activities in the home school district. So this includes athletics, things like chess club, debate club, band, so long as it's not a graded activity. Or an activity that the student would receive a grade, of course. So this could, the way extracurricular activities is defined in the statute, it may even allow a student to attend a field trip at the public school district of residence, even though they don't attend that school, so long as that field trip is not part of a graded activity. So it's a real advantage in that you can still participate in those extracurricular activities if you're attending a school that doesn't offer those. And then, everything else is the same though. So the student must be of the appropriate age and grade level, of course, and then the student must fulfill the same academic, non-academic, and financial requirements as any other participant. So, they have to be the same age, grade. If there's tryouts, they have to go through tryouts. And if there are fees, they have to pay fees to participate in the extracurricular. And that's really the end of my presentation, although I'm happy to take any questions at this point before we move on to Lauren.
All right, well, if people are thinking about questions and typing them in, I'll go ahead and get started just to make sure that we kind of stay on time here. So I am going to talk about homeschooling, which I know Mark mentioned in the beginning of his that what's been happening these past few months due to COVID-19, and a lot of parents say that they're homeschooling their children. Although it feels like that, and parents have been providing a lot of support to kids. In order to homeschool your child, there actually is a set of criteria and things that you have to go through and requirements with your local district. And then they in turn need to do things and submit with the state. So it actually is different. Your child is unenrolled from their local district, so they're not enrolled in that district. So it actually is different than what we're saying is homeschooling, what's been happening the last few months here. So throughout my presentation, I'm just going to start with exactly what I just mentioned, the requirements, how to actually homeschool your child and legally do that. Then we're going to talk about some opportunities for homeschool students, what that looks like, scholarships and college preparation, as well as college credit plus opportunities. We'll hit on special education a little bit and diplomas, what that looks like for students who are homeschooled. And then the pros and cons, ultimately, of homeschooling. So first, I'll just tell you that the requirement for homeschooling is under the Ohio Revised Code 3321.04. So if you just Google that, you'll come up with the revised code. Additionally, you'll actually find quite a bit of information on the Ohio Department of Education's website. And then there are tons of blogs and resources for parents or guardians that are interested in homeschooling. So there's a plethora of information out there online. I think it's just sorting through and then ultimately determining, what is best for your child in terms of all the different education options and really what's best for your child and then your family. And that is Division A2 is where you'll find the actual homeschooling requirements. So under the law, I'll just read you this, what home education actually means. It means an education primarily directed and provided by the parent or guardian of a child. And again, it says under Division A2 of Section 3321.04 of the Revised Code, which child is of compulsory school age and is not enrolled in a non-public school. Okay, so just to give you some numbers, on ODE's website, you can actually find an Excel spreadsheet that tells you how many students in your district are homeschooled, which is kind of interesting. So in 2019, there were over 32,000 students in the state being homeschooled. And we'll talk about exactly how you make that happen. I looked at a couple local districts. So Bexley, for example, had 0 students being homeschooled in 2019. While Columbus Public Schools had over 800. So kind of see a range. And then, Cuyahoga County had, they had 122 that year. So it really just depends, but you can actually go and see your own district and see how many students would be homeschooled in that district. And those numbers have been steadily rising the past few years. So 5 years ago, it was about 5,000 less students. So the numbers have been increasing. So first, requirements of homeschooling. How do you make this happen? So first, you have to withdraw your student from their current school and district. So that's really important to know. Ultimately, parents are the ones that are responsible for notifying the superintendent of the school district that their child would attend or is attending. So that's if you're currently attending a school in the district and then you've suddenly decided, next semester, next quarter, you want to homeschool, you can do that. Or if at the start of the year you decide, before the school year starts, you want to homeschool, that's fine too. You just need to be able to submit a notice of intent to homeschool to the superintendent. And that needs to be done no later than the first week of the normal school calendar that would be starting for your district. Or if you're withdrawing your student and deciding to homeschool them, same thing, you need to submit that notice within a week of withdrawing your student. And there actually is a really great notice. I can put the link in the chat box, but by the end of the presentation, so you guys have it, but there actually is an example notice kind of that ODE recommends that you send to the superintendent of your district. So that's great. So kind of one thing to do already for you. And that's the case. There's some information that you need to include. So birth date, address, curriculum outline, teaching materials, some general information for the superintendent. Then the superintendent has to write a note and excuse the student, basically. So they are releasing the student from what Mark had mentioned before as the required compulsory education for the state. The parents of a homeschooling child need to be able to provide 900 hours of instruction each year. And every year you want to homeschool your child, you actually need to resubmit that notice of intent to homeschool. So just because you did it one year doesn't mean that it's through the child's education. You need to tell the school district every single year, yep, my intent is to continue to homeschool this year. There's a bunch of information online that tells you the exact subjects that you need to provide. And there's a lot of flexibility within that, but some of them, for example, would be language, reading, spelling, health education, physical education, music, art, all those different things that you would kind of normally think you would get in a high school curriculum. And then parents are required to submit assessments of their child's progress, and that all is also under the Ohio Revised Code, and there are requirements for that. And they're also required to have their own credentials to some extent. So basically that means you have to have your own high school diploma or GED in order to be that person that's actually homeschooling the child. Or there's other certificates or tests that can show that as well. The child then also, there's a portfolio that has to go along with the homeschooling for kids. And again, that's just showing that the child is making progress kind of on grade level or what would be typical of that child's abilities if they were in their local district or not. So the superintendent then, they have their own requirements and things that they need to do. And so they basically need to, within 14 days of you submitting your notice, they need to give you a response. So they're either going to excuse your child or they're going to deny that request. I would say it's rare that they would deny that request, but for some reasons they might on occasion. And if that's the case, you actually do have the opportunity to file for due process and, be able to work your way through that if for whatever reason, you were denied and your child wasn't excused from compulsory education. So moving on from that, I just want to talk a little bit about opportunities for homeschool students. So homeschool students can still utilize College Credit Plus, which is a great opportunity for our students in the state. It means that they can earn college credit while participating, in high school, and they earn it simultaneously. So the classes are completed through public universities, also private, could be a private university. However, those might be some small fees associated with the private universities. But for public universities, if the student is taking classes through them and earning those credits, dual high school and credit and college, then that's free through public institutions in Ohio, which is fabulous. So that's grades 7 through 12. And there has been some changes due to COVID-19, but typically you would need to actually fill out a form with the Ohio Department of Education to let them know that you have the intent to participate in College Credit Plus, and that's usually due April 1st, but due to COVID, it's actually changed and they've pushed that a little bit. So, you know, check online to make sure if that's something you're interested in. Something that we always tell students and parents as well is just by filling out that form, it doesn't mean that, you know, you're tied to having to do college credit plus. So err on the side of filling out the forms, getting it submitted on time if your student is at all even interested, because of course at the end of the day they don't have to do it. But if they don't meet those deadlines, then you know, they wouldn't be eligible for that. Sports and activities, Mark kind of went over this. So it's the same with homeschool students. So homeschool students have the opportunity to participate in extracurricular activities just like a student who would be in the district. Now in saying that, it means that if your student would have gotten cut on the middle school basketball team, just because they're homeschool student, you know, they have to try out and meet all the different eligibility requirements just like any other athlete, you know, musician, anything like that. And an extracurricular activity is something that's non-graded. I think Mark had mentioned that. So again, there are a lot of opportunities for social interaction, extracurriculars, things that of course could go on a college transcript and resume that are really going to help students. Even if they're homeschooled, they can still participate with the district of residence. And actually, there's kind of a little exception too. If there's some type of activity that your child wants to participate in and your district doesn't have it, but say the neighboring district has it, you can actually petition the school and go and do that activity in that other district. Now it's up to the superintendent of that other district that has the activity, but sometimes they do allow students to participate in those activities, which is, again, really great opportunity. I'm just going to touch on scholarships briefly and diplomas so that we can answer some questions about that. If anybody has specific questions too, I'm happy to answer questions. But students are eligible for scholarships, and in terms of college preparation, just because you're a homeschooled student does not mean that, you know, you wouldn't be eligible for college scholarships. There's actually things from EdChoice as well you can look up online. So there's scholarships through EdChoice. And then ultimately diplomas can be issued by the parents. So once all of the requirements are met, just like any other high school student, the parent gets to basically create whatever diploma they want. Each state is a little bit different in the way that they do this. So some states on their Department of Education website, they actually have kind of a recommended diploma, a template that you can have. Ohio is not one of them, or at least not yet. And then other states, they actually have, they allow students to get a diploma from the local school district. That's pretty rare though. So typically it's just the parent kind of, you know, creating that diploma and graduation experience for your child, which I know a lot of people have been doing this past month in celebrating the seniors. So that's just something that as a homeschooled, you know, parent and child that you would do for your kid. So at this point, you know, does anybody have any questions? I think I see two in the question box. So, okay, let's see. And Mark,
do you want me to ask the one for you out loud, or can you see that on your end?
I can see it, but since you're moderating, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, so we do have a question for Lauren. It says, I want to start a homeschool co-op and hire a new grad to teach approximately 7 kids from an outdoor location like a park pavilion. That would be lower risk for virus transmission. Are there any funds available to me to help pay for a teacher?
Okay, great question. So I actually do have that as part of my, you know, kind of a little bit later on. So we'll talk about funding, and it's, you know, it will be specific to your situation. So I'm going to say possibly, and then I'll get into a little bit more specifics as I go on. So it has to, you know, it has to, obviously there are requirements and it has to fall under those requirements. As Mark mentioned too, if any of the kids are on any type of, you know, have a disability that would, in the school setting, allow them to be on an IEP, they would potentially be eligible for funds from the John Peterson Scholarship, which is wonderful, and that could pay for tutoring, different therapies, things of that nature. But again, that wouldn't cover necessarily all 7 of those kids. So we can talk about that. There are also specific grants available for homeschooling. So kind of maybe in the situation you're talking about, it depends if you guys are homeschooling and each of you are filling out the requirements, you know, unenrolling your child, withdrawing them, and then filling out the requirements with your local school district, or there's actually a way that you could basically kind of become your own little, private school kind of thing. And if usually those are more with like a religious base, some of those that we've seen. So there are other grants out there too, and I have that here, and there's a website that I can share as well. That's really good. That has grants specific for kind of situations like this. So diplomas, again, I kind of mentioned that diplomas would be typical, like a high school student. So once you've met those standards, you're eligible for the diploma. They can be printed and issued from the parent, have a celebration for your child. It can look however you want. And ACT, SAT, so in terms of college preparation, homeschool students, end up going to fabulous colleges and universities or career tech programs, just like students that are doing public school, private school, or things like Mark mentioned, some of our e-schools. So those are still options and opportunities for sure. Just a couple caveats that I would say is the college application process is very similar. So it's going to look the same. You're going to have to do the online essays, and if you're doing the common application or whatever requirements that college or university has that your child is interested in attending. The only exceptions for a homeschool child would be so that transcript, right? You're not going to have, this computer program that's generating a transcript like a typical school would have. There are things online that can help you to kind of, have templates. There are parent blogs on all of this, but the transcript is something that ultimately the parent is responsible for. So, you just have to show the college university what classes the student took, what grades they got, what their GPA was, how it was weighted, how you're doing that, so that the college can, rate the student and basically, go through the admissions process just like any other student. The other thing that might be a little bit trickier sometimes for students that are homeschooled would be getting those letters of recommendation, since of course we know, typically your parent wouldn't write you a letter of recommendation, or a family member or something like that. In homeschooling, it's a little bit different of a situation because the parent was the one that was really providing that education. So it's not to say that a parent, couldn't write that and couldn't explain that in their letter and explain, I've homeschooled my child for X years, all of that. So if that's the case, there's lots of opportunities for letters of recommendation though, from, somebody in the church, maybe a coach or a music teacher, a local organization your child was volunteering with. Maybe they had a job during, all throughout high school, and their boss is willing to write them a letter. So you just have to be a little bit creative in that. So it's not that it's, out of the question, it's just being creative in how you're going to do that. And the only other thing is that, sometimes a higher emphasis is placed on test scores, just because there are no other means of really comparing what that transcript is to, a transcript that a college would typically see. Homeschool students are eligible for financial aid and need-based aid, just like any, traditional student. And then actually on FAFSA, when you fill that out, there is a box that you need to check for homeschooling. So that'll actually be checked so the college knows that your child was homeschooled from that box as well. Private scholarships, so those are ones that are coming from businesses, and homeschool students are eligible for those, just like any other student, and just they have to meet the criteria, and then of course apply and go through the process for that. And oftentimes parents will actually use the curriculum that they're homeschooling their kids with, and put college application or college essays as one of the kind of the requirements, one of the things that the student's working on. So you can use essays that you were working on, to then apply for college. And then merit scholarships. So again, oftentimes merit scholarships end up kind of two of the bigger factors in a lot of merit scholarships are GPA and a test score, right? So an ACT and SAT, something like that. So if a homeschool student can take the ACT or SAT, that's they can prepare for it like any other student would prepare and take that. So that is one thing that, I think keeping track of what schools you're interested in and what criteria the school needs is really important. although a lot of schools have actually gone to test optional in general for all students. So they do not require you to submit an ACT or SAT score anymore. Again, I mentioned like there's online resources for how to actually submit calculate the GPA. So that's something, there's blog posts on that and resources for parents. And then there's actually, there's a list of homeschool specific scholarships. So if you just Google, I found some from Home Education Recognition Organization. It's called HERO, HERO. And they've got a lot of great resources. And these scholarships are actually just specific to students that were homeschooled. Also, be creative. I always tell people, think outside of the box. So is your student, is there something career-based, maybe women in engineering or STEM, or employer-based? So, Starbucks or other companies offer scholarships. Some are disability-based, NCAA, Homeschool Legal Defense Association. They actually have a contest just for homeschool students. So you can actually win a scholarship that way. So I'm going to go on to the funding part really fast, and then we'll talk special ed real quick, and then we can kind of wrap up with specific Q&A. So Ohio does not provide any state funding specifically for homeschool students. Okay, so there's nothing, sitting in a pot, for example, that Ohio has for parents and for students that are being homeschooled. So that's not an option. But like I had mentioned earlier, so there are other resources available. So for example, some of the curriculums that you might want to use can actually be borrowed or rented, right? So you're not going out and spending all of this money annually on different curriculums. Again, I know the one question is about co-ops. That's a great way to be able to save money. I've seen some really interesting co-ops where it's all the different parents, right? So it's multiple parents that come together that have different experiences, different backgrounds, and they educate the students kind of based on what their expertise are. Of course, within the requirements, making sure that the students are getting all the different curriculum and subjects. But it's been it's a really neat way to do it. So in the co-op situation like that, on Mondays they're with so and so learning X. On Tuesdays they're learning Y with somebody else. So that's an interesting way to do it too, and a way to share resources. And then Ohio is, so I mentioned there was actually a link, a website that has specific funding that is potentially, is just for homeschool situations. So that is homeschoolfoundation.org. And there's probably other ones out there. That's just, one that I've heard of before. And so they do all kinds of different things. So that's something to look into. So there are different grants, right, which is basically free money available. But in terms of, any type of funding from the state, you're not going to get funding from the state in order to homeschool your student. But sharing the resources, I think, can be really, really fabulous in the co-op. So special education, again, the Peterson Scholarship is something that you could potentially use as funding if your child has a disability and needs different therapies, like occupational therapy, maybe speech therapy. Again, there are online resources for all of that. And then really, because homeschooling is so individualized anyway, your student isn't going to be on an IEP, right? So if that's the case, and we just got a question that came in that said, are kids on 529 eligible for the Peterson funding? So if they have, a qualifying disability, then yeah, they would be, Erin, right? So it just depends what that 529 is for, but likely it's probably, for example, like if they broke their arm and only needed a 529 plan for, 6 weeks because they couldn't write and they needed a scribe or something, then no, right? I mean, maybe they're not, they wouldn't be eligible in that sense. But if it was for something, where they would be eligible for therapies, potentially they could be. It depends. But if it's a 529 plan where they really need other services, then it might actually be a student who needs an IEP instead. So we see that oftentimes and can chat about that afterward, or you're welcome to call or email us for more information on that. So additionally, I think I mentioned a homeschool can kind of operate as a private school if there's a religious involvement. So that's kind of that one gray area, Erin, I think, to answer your question from before. So probably likely it would come from a grant, what you're thinking. But ultimately, homeschooling is really specialized anyway. And so sometimes homeschool parents will create something called a specialized education or specialized learning plan for their student. But really that's kind of the whole point of homeschooling anyway. Last but not least, I just wanted to go through some of the pros and cons, and then we'll still leave about 10 minutes for 9 or 10 minutes for questions. So first of all, when I say pros and cons, I think the main thing here is that this is going to be different for every single child in every family. So a pro, for one child might be a con for another. I know, like Mark had mentioned, some of our clients and the students we work with, some of them really have struggled with the online learning due to COVID, and others, for example, maybe that have anxiety, on the autism spectrum, they've just thrived being at home. So it really just depends, on your student, on the family. It does provide for flexibility for parents and children. You kind of create your own schedule, right? So, if you want to work really hard in the mornings, go play in the afternoon, and then, work more at night, that's a possibility. You can really watch your kids grow and progress throughout their education. It creates really close relationships and bonds with parents and kids. Again, you're tailoring this to your child's specific needs. Of course, a child on an IEP in school, hopefully that would be the case, that what's happening in a district as well. You can cater a little bit more to your own values and potentially morally, religiously, all of those things. One thing that homeschool parents say, is it limits negative interactions for their children. So we know that bullying is an issue. We know bullying happens all the time. I think the reality is there's still cyberbullying. There's still ways that kids can be bullied. Although, if they're not going into that school setting every day, that might be something that is a little bit limited if they're at home. So that might not be as big of an issue. Again, family vacations, some families that really like to travel or want to be somewhere else for a couple months during the year, something like that. Homeschooling can be mobile, so you can kind of get up and leave. I know the biggest thing too is coming this fall, what is school going to look like? What is the education environment going to look like this fall due to COVID? So of course, having your child at home, to some extent, there's fewer safety concerns, right? So we talk about school shootings and, really scary things that are happening in school. And unfortunately, so, it's a way to kind of know that maybe, for you, it lessens the anxiety that your student is at home learning. Also predictability, right? So if you're at home, it's a lot more stable and predictable environment, which might be really great for some kids. Individual attention, again, I mentioned that should be something hopefully the students receiving kind of regardless if they were on an IEP at school. Again, you can work at your own pace. Similar to eSchools, what Mark had talked about, kind of setting your own schedule in that sense, potentially maybe for early graduation would be an option. Learning independence, self-reliance, all wonderful things. Sometimes parents are learning with their children, which I think we've all experienced at one point or another. And homeschooling, you're really in the thick of it, right? So you're having to learn probably yourself. Again, not that wouldn't happen in a typical school environment as well. And just a few more here to close out, and then Mark and I can jump back on and both answer some more questions. Some cons, just to kind of end with, again, these, are just maybe some challenges that would be if your child's homeschooled. So, sometimes there's a stigma, right, attached with being homeschooled, even though I told you there's, almost 33,000 students being homeschooled in the state of Ohio. When you get to college or something like that, or in a job, a student, sometimes people attach negative connotations with that, like they don't socially interact, which is of course not true. It just, is a stigma that is out there still, I think, this day and age, unfortunately. Again, I think sometimes people think that a student would have less exposure to the world or resources or experiences, which, I don't think is true either. I think, again, this can be a pro or a con depending, on what your district looks like, what resources your district has. And then really what you're doing with your student at home, right? What you're doing with your child and what experiences you guys are having together. Again, are you taking advantage of the resources that you would have with your local district and, going on field trips? So I don't necessarily think that that's a con at all. A few last things I think just to touch on. It is a lot of pressure for parents. I think, you know, it's a huge responsibility to be educating your own child on your own. It's a lot of time and energy and all of those things. I think also homeschooling, you know, can impact mental health and relationships, which can be really hard because now you're wearing multiple hats in addition to, you know, being that parent. Again, it can be financially straining depending on the curriculum you choose, the different resources that, you know, you want to get for your child in order to do that.
Hey, Lauren, real quick, let me jump in. There was a question that I think has to do with what you just said. So, you know, talking about financial strain or financial ability and the stresses on parents, can you hire a teacher to do your homeschool? That's a question we just got.
That's a good question. So really it should be by the parent or the guardian is really the person that's supposed to be homeschooling the child. You know, again, I think these co-op situations are things like that that can happen. So, you know, under the code, that's something that might change, and we can look up and answer that for you kind of more specifically, kind of due to COVID. I'm not sure if things are going to change. You know, but that home education really is kind of supposed to be managed by the parent or guardian of the child. You know, I think the state doesn't want situations where parents are just getting together and going out and hiring teachers and kind of, in essence, creating their own little mini schools. So, you know, there might be a workaround for that. But in terms, you know, the expectation really be that the parent is kind of doing, you know, doing that teaching and educating at home. Are there any other questions? I'm trying to look at, let's see. Oh, there we go. Okay, perfect.
Lauren, one clarification on that point, because it is a good question about if you can hire a teacher. You can. The qualifications at ODE right here are that you or the person providing instruction have to meet those criteria. So I think you can hire and use a teacher, but the question was a little bit more focused, and I think you answered it right. On the parent or guardian is ultimately responsible for directing the education, choosing the curriculum, and petitioning, you know, the school for approval on the homeschooling process. And you can use a teacher, and that includes, you know, guest teachers, but those people or the person would have to be approved, you know, when you apply, and the parent does direct, you know, the application and is in charge of the curriculum.
Right, exactly. The parent needs to be the one, you know, submitting to the district, unenrolling their child, doing all of that stuff, and then, you know, ultimately, you know, being the one, like Mark said, I think the best education. You know, so again, I think, you know, I would just caution parents in the sense that you're just meeting the requirements, right? So ODE does a pretty darn good job of laying everything out online and really making sure that, you know, your student is getting the right, you know, the right classes, those type of things, and making progress, I think, is the biggest thing. You want your student to make progress. So whichever direction you kind of choose, you know what I mean? At the end of the day, you want them to make progress, you know, in their education and ultimately, you know, be happy, right? With what you guys have chosen as a family to do.
Okay, I do have an anonymous question that came through probably for Mark on eSchools. So Mark, do eSchools provide a high school diploma recognized by the state?
Yes, you can get the same diploma from an eSchool that you can get from a traditional public school. Good question. One other thing, if we're through the questions, I'm not sure, but you know, the Department of Education does rank its schools. It provides a report card for all traditional public schools, community schools, and eSchools, and that is available online. Just I would say, I think Leslie has the link that she can share, but I'd say you make sure you're comparing apples to apples. You know, if you're comparing, if you're looking at eSchools, make sure you're looking at e-schools that provide K-12 education to the general population and not comparing it with a dropout and recovery school. And I wouldn't say, I'd say, because it's a complicated report card process, complicated and controversial, I would say it's even difficult to compare an e-school with a traditional public school, just because they're serving really two different populations. But the report cards are there to, and I would use it as one source of information when you're making a decision about an e-school. And they are graded on several different categories too. And then they give one overall cumulative grade, letter grade A, B, C, D, or F.
And Mark, do you want to touch on just the way that that's working with COVID right now for reporting?
I'm not entirely sure what they're going to do about state report cards for this year. I don't know. If you know, please share.
Well, yeah, I wasn't sure if you had known that, but for, I guess we can just include first in terms of state testing, if you were something like that for students, that has been waived for states. So, that's not something that you'd be able to look at for this specific school year to see how, how students did on state tests, right, in your district.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, they're going to have to amend somehow the report cards for schools just because the state testing is a factor they consider, and that wasn't done at the end of the year.
Right. So it might look a little bit different in this school year and potentially into the fall as well.
Yep.
All right, great. So I think that's all the questions we have. If you don't have anything to add, Mark and Lauren, we are like right at 8:01, which is pretty good. So any last questions out there lingering? Please type now. Any last words, Mark or Lauren?
No, thank you for attending.
Yeah, thanks.
Hopefully it was helpful.
Yep, thanks everybody. And if you have specific questions, you can always reach us. We are working. We can set up virtual meetings with you or phone consults. So give us a call, 614-745-2001. And everybody stay healthy. Thank you.